Welcome back to One More Mana. My name is Derik, and today we're getting into a series I've kind of been teasing for a little while. We're taking a quick break from Strixhaven, and one thing I've mentioned is for a lot of the decks that I play personally, it's about a handful of decks that I kind of always go back and forth between. I've done deck techs for them, but they've changed so much. A lot of these I've deck teched a year plus ago, some even 2 years ago, and some of them are almost not even recognizable from the form that I initially deck teched on the channel. So I want to do these little deck updates for my personal decks that really are going to be full-on deck techs because of how much of a difference you'll see between the initial version and these current versions of these decks. I know for me personally, I love watching deck techs. One of the small frustrations I can have is when I find one I'm really into and it's a couple years old and you know that the current version probably isn't that and you kind of want to see what that is. I kind of want to bring that to y'all, especially for the decks that I really just can't stop playing. And now I did my top 5 favorite decks of all time. So the first one I'm going to be doing for this deck update should be zero surprise, and it is none other than the Scarab God. Now this Scarab God deck has changed a lot since I've last talked about it, so I'm super excited to get into it. But if you want any of the cards in here from the initial build or this new build, head on over to TCG Player. TCG Player is phenomenal. You can find any cards you're looking for. You'll take a look at my personal deck list. I got all types of shiny goodies in here. If you want any of those, TCG Player will have them. And if you use the affiliate link down below in the description, it'll help support the channel in the process. We really do appreciate all the help. But looking at this new Scarab God list, really the only way to categorize it is just full on a Scarab God artifact deck now, which is much different from the direction it was in before. I just noticed myself kind of organically it got here. Over time, I noticed myself adding more and more artifacts to the deck that just happened to go well with the Scarab God. Before I knew it, I was in the range of like 22, 23 artifacts. And I kind of stopped and thought, I was like, what if I just kind of took the leap and just threw in more artifacts, get to the near 30 mark and just run like a full-on artifact deck in Dimir with the Scarab God at the head? Could that work? And sort of is the answer, but it's a lot of fun. It doesn't necessarily win quite as much, but it does so in some very strange and I think really exciting ways. So we're going to go through category by category, looking at the biggest changes I made, and really when we get to the game winning step, it might become clear as just to why I decided that this artifact theme was even more for me than the initial Scarab God list was. One thing to point out before we get into it, the slight change in this deck is previously the deck was all about the Scarab God. That was the whole basically win con of the deck, was you were milling people, taking their best cards and trying to win through the advantage of stealing awesome ETBs and awesome creatures. This deck really uses artifacts now as the wheels that get everything going. You can honestly go through periods where you don't use the Scarab God at all except to finish and basically set up your game finishing combinations, combos, synergies, whatever they are. And you're going to do fine because of these artifact synergies. And that's something I found I really like, where I don't find myself just having to play control and survival the whole game up until that late game where you kind of take over. You can really do some cool stuff aside from the Scarab God while still taking full advantage of that reanimate, because it is still key to the deck. It's not just an artifact deck with the Scarab God. The Scarab God is still really the thing that keeps this deck going and keeps the winning synergies possible for you. We'll start with the creatures, and the creatures are so different from the initial build. I really had switched out quite a few creatures looking back at the original list. One of the biggest differences is taking full advantage of the Gear Hulks now. So Noxious Gear Hulk and Torrential Gear Hulk. Torrential may have been in the initial list, but these are substituting out other kill effects or reanimate effects that we may have had in previous versions for artifact creatures. And there's a few different ways we can do stuff like this. I mean, we have Ramp and Burnished Heart, Ramp and Card Draw, and Sad Robot. There are so many effects that we already had on artifacts. Just throwing in more of those on artifact creatures was really easy to do. Some of the best ones, though, are going to be stuff like Emery. Emery is such a powerful card in and of itself, but the fact that it mills you, which we already want to be milling ourselves to get everything set up, and then lets us cast artifacts from the graveyard is huge. Scarab God is great to go ahead and bring back that Worm Coil or that Noxious Gear Hulk or that Sad Robot. But with Emery, we can cast things without having to exile them and get to reuse things over and over. It's also a great way to get back our non-creature artifacts, which obviously the Scarab God can't do for us. So Emery isn't just an all-star in this deck. And one of the best things about having that Scarab God as your commander is even if Emery gets milled, we can go ahead and make a zombie-powered version of the card, still get that ETB, and then still be able to bring things back. And that's a lot of the limits the Scarab God has by itself. You're able to reanimate creatures you have to kind of take that extra reach to interact with other artifacts. Another great example of this is Arcbound Ravager, which I love because we have so much recursion. Having a sack outlet for your artifacts is huge in this deck because you don't want your artifacts exiled. That could put you in a real bad situation. having your artifacts in the battlefield or even in the graveyard, and you'll see why, is great for you. But yeah, exile, not so much. So this sack outlet is huge. I didn't go super far into artifact sack outlets, but even just having one or two to make sure that you have access, because again, with the Scarab God in your mill, you're going to be having access to Arcbound Ravager most of the time in this deck, and it is great to have that at instant speed, sometimes even just sitting in your graveyard. Another addition that I was really excited about that I got to run now that it's an artifact deck is Mirror Battlesphere. And this basically kind of just directly takes this spot of Grave Titan I had from before. Anytime you get a chance to cheat out a Mirror Battlesphere, always a good idea, and it just hadn't had a deck for it in a while, and this was a perfect spot for us to go ahead, cheat, get some mirrors out, and go ahead and get those crazy synergies going. With the artifacts, obviously this is an artifact deck now, so we have a ton of artifacts, and they're, for the most part, the majority are unchanged. A lot of these are just regular stuff we'd want, with a lot of mana rocks for ramp and different things like that. One thing I did notice playing the old Scarab God version was you get your Mind Crank and your Mesmeric Orb destroyed a lot. Nobody wants to see those cards stick around. People do not like having their stuff milled. And now having all these artifact recursive engines in your deck, all of a sudden these getting destroyed isn't the end of the world for you. You can keep getting them back, which is amazing. So I do love, and that's kind of was the first push that happened for me, is I wanted more artifact recursion so these pieces could keep coming back, and that's kind of what led to everything else. This is just an awesome way to make sure these are available, because when these cards are out, you're in a really good spot to either mill people, just to like mill them out to lose, or to mill them enough to where they're gonna have some bombs in their graveyard. And in addition to all this artifact stuff, you stealing their best stuff with Scarab God is kind of just gravy thrown on top of all the other stuff you got going on. And the other artifacts that really have gotten added over time are the swords. And this is just, if you're building this deck and you want to build it, it's really whatever swords you have available. I mean, they're really the best one in the deck is Sword of Body and Mind, but I threw in Feast and Famine and Sword of Fire and Ice. I really enjoy just playing with these, and the type of deck that the Scarab God ended up being, where you're kind of playing control-y and you stall out a decent amount, having these as ways to both get in damage and get cool effects I found to be great in my other Scarab, just the regular Scarab God build, but even more so with these artifact synergies, because these are also huge removal targets. Having ways to bring these back is great. Having all the different artifact synergies for these is amazing. And these really can turn into not only huge value engines, but in some cases finishers. Because as you get into the late game, buffing that Scarab God up and be able to get through damage, I found to be huge. And it sounds weird, but I've finished off more players, I feel like, late game through suiting up the Scarab God with these swords than I have from the actual drain ability on the Scarab God, even when I had the zombie synergies. So these have just done work for me, really, as this deck has evolved over time. One card that I do have in these artifacts that I was so excited to find a slot for, I have had a pre-release foil of this for I don't know how long, I could never find a home for it, and it is Inspiring Statuary. This card requires such a weird balance of artifacts and non-artifacts that I've never found a deck to make this work, and I think this is perfect for it. Because this lets us tap those swords and that Mind Crank, Mesmeric Orb, all those random artifacts we have, those can tap for mana to cast our non-artifact spells, which is phenomenal in a deck where we have so much instant speed interaction, where we're trying to play sort of a control game in addition to this artifact sub-theme. This card is so good in this deck. This is the type of thing where you get this out and your mana just becomes, it blows up all of a sudden, where you can then on your turn get a lot of your bombs out, basically leave your swords up as mana rocks, and then still have that instant speed interaction on other players' turns. This is a ridiculous card in this deck, and I was very excited. Again, there's a handful of reasons why I made this artifact deck work for the Scarab God, and this was one of those, finally finding a deck for this thing to work. With the enchantments, these are almost identical to the previous list. I really didn't change much, except for one notable exclusion that I gotta say for the game-winning stuff. It's too good to talk about right now. But yeah, there's nothing too crazy here. I would say the most important one I found over time in this deck is Search for Azcanta, because this is the type of card where you drop it early, it fills your graveyard up, you can get card selection with it for grabbing non-creatures, which are some of the keys to this deck. It's just an insanely powerful card in so many decks, but I would say it's one of the cards where I will keep an opening hand just because it's in it, because it really sets you up early game that well. Now with the sorceries, this really gets me to point out the fact that while this is a full-on artifact deck, it still does have a mill sub-theme. Your primary purpose of this deck is never to mill everyone out, but it becomes such a cool engine that synergizes so well with the other things you're trying to do, that it's still a viable way to do stuff. You want to mill everyone in this deck. This is not like a targeted milling your opponent's deck or targeted milling yourself. Really milling everyone benefits you because you want a full graveyard, but you also want your opponents to have full graveyards because the Scarab God works best when you have all the options in the world. So that's why something like a Mnemonic Betrayal is phenomenal, because it really gives you access to things you might not otherwise have. We are in Dimir, maybe we want effects in other colors. This is just a great way through the process of we're already milling people to get that advantage. And speaking of milling people, Maddening Cacophony is still a crazy powerful card. As I was making so many cuts to the previous list, I could not allow myself to cut this card because for 6 mana, getting half of everyone's libraries in the graveyard, you have so many options with the Scarab God. It turns your commander into a toolbox that is just completely insane, a boundless toolbox essentially to do whatever you need done, all for 6 mana. So that's something that I just couldn't give up in this deck. And in some cases with some other synergies, it's kind of a way to kill people if you have enough mill online. And for similar reasons, Life's Finale is also still in this deck. Again, we get to select specific creatures in opponent's decks, put them in the graveyard, and get targets for the Scarab God. With the instance, they are almost unchanged from the initial deck list, really. The biggest change I think I have is adding Stubborn Denial, which I did not know existed until very recently, so that's why it wasn't in there. It's basically like a fair version of Fierce Guardianship, so I love that card in this deck. It is just super powerful. It's like an extra swan song, essentially. And that's really the biggest difference as I'm looking at it. I think if you're building this deck, you have to put in Grizzly Spectacle. And more so just for flavor purposes. Obviously, there's better options. Put in Grizzly Spectacle. I have had more fun turns playing Grizzly Spectacle. There is nothing better than one of your opponents making this giant, scary creature swinging at you and you milling them for a bunch. I think Kyle was playing Oboon one time and had like a 20-something land, and I got to Grizzly Spectacle it, and it just felt so good. Really, the most important thing with these instances, though, that's the same from the previous version into this version, though, is you need really powerful interaction, because the Scarab God himself kind of just looks scary and people will try to kill you for playing the Scarab God. And the type of builds I've done really don't back it up like that. You're not going to be winning very fast. You don't have these explosive zombie turns where you just kill everyone. So you need other ways to survive. And this is the type of deck where early game you might not have a huge board presence to protect yourself. So stuff like Cryptic Command or Mystic Confluence or Sublime Epiphany or even something like a Sudden Spoiling are insanely powerful, great ways to survive the early game if someone just tries to aggro you out real fast. And that stuff I've noticed in both versions of the deck, they're of equal importance and they play a similar role, but you really need that in here, because if you don't play those and you don't have ways to tap down boards or get rid of creatures' powers and stuff, you'll find yourself really dying before you ever get a chance to do all the cool stuff you're trying to do late game. With the lands, really the only change I've made is going to be Vault of Whispers and Seed of the Synod, the 2 artifact lands I did put in here. I didn't put every artifact land available, just those 2, and it seems to be enough just to get some of those artifact synergies. I do have some Metalcraft stuff that I do want to go ahead and get online, so those are in here. Outside of that, I'm pretty sure the mana base is basically the exact same, and if you're building this from scratch, nothing fancy is needed in this mana base. Really, it's not a super mana intensive deck, so really just all basics are fine. Throw in those artifact lands because those are cheap. One thing that's not cheap but is great in here is Field of the Dead. That's really the only zombie synergy I've kept in the deck just because it's a land slot and I already had it in there. Field of the Dead is phenomenal in the deck. No surprise, and I found it to be a great way late game, if all else fails, to at least get some cool zombie synergies going in the hope of getting a little bit of Drain and Scry to try to pull one out of nowhere if all else is just really just not going well. And also in the lands, obviously with High Market and Phyrexian Tower, I've talked about this in both videos, but sack outlets for the Scarab God are huge. Putting those on lands is a no-brainer, and so that's what I would focus on. All the other dual lands, Cabal Coffers, all that crap, not super important. I would say make sure you have your sack outlets, have those artifact lands, and everything else will kind of take care of itself. And that is going to do it for the categories. Now let's get into the most exciting part of every deck tech, but in this case, the machiniest part. And that is the game-winning step. How are you about to win the game with this deck? So the first way to win the game in this deck is going to be the most boring way because it's the exact same way as before, but it's that whole little combo of Fraying Sanity and Maddening Cacophony. This is just such a kind of a cheap way to win, but it's a way I've found to be necessary in this deck sometimes. Go ahead and put Fraying Sanity on one player, Maddening Cacophony kicked, that player loses at the end step if they don't have any removal. This has been the most consistent way to take somebody out in this deck I found it, and it is kind of cheap and people kind of get salty about it, but yeah, it needs to be in here. That's one of the reasons why I don't run as many tutors, is because I don't want to be tempted to tutor for this monstrosity. But it's kind of just a tried and true way if you're really not doing well in a game to just kind of pull one out of your ass, so to speak. So it's not fun, but I do have it in there for now. Now, the second way to win the game in this deck is really the synergy that made me think this might actually work as a deck idea. I was very skeptical the entire time I was building and playing it, but this one is really kind of explosive. And it's all because of a card called Marionette Master, and specifically its synergy with the Scarab God. So when you eternalize the Marionette Master with the Scarab God, it becomes a 4/4, and then you can throw those 3+1 counters onto it to make it a 7/7, meaning whenever your artifacts die, some players just losing 7 life per artifact. And when you get into the late game, that adds up fast. And the dream synergy is to get this Marionette Master out with an Arcbound Ravager, which is your artifact sack outlet. If you have a Worm Coil engine, automatically right there, that's hitting somebody for 21. That is insane. If you have a Mirror Battlesphere, it's a whole lot more than that. And you can just start taking people out. This synergy is ridiculous. And it's also a great kind of protection, which I completely messed up on stream last week, or if someone tries to Vandal Blast you or anything like that. Once Marionette Master hits your graveyard, it becomes very scary to do, because all of a sudden you just steal it out with your Scarab God, Marionette Master's this big 7/7, and you are throwing all of that life loss at that person that blew up all your stuff. This is such a cool synergy. Marionette Master is already so powerful in artifact decks, but I really haven't been able to see it used with Scarab God specifically, and it's a really fun, weird way to try to win a game with the Scarab God deck, and it's really the thing I shoot for most every game, and it's the thing I'm trying to get going. Hasn't worked a ton yet, but when it does go off, oh, it just feels so good. And now for our weekly trip to Phyrexia. And you might be wondering, Derik, are you playing Infect with the Scarab God? How are you throwing Infect in here? I don't see a single Infect card on your deck list. You're lying to us. So we're not actually playing any Infect in this deck. We're taking a trip to Phyrexia in a different way. And it's a beautiful card. And it's a card I opened in a pack and just put in a binder and just would stare at it sometimes to be happy. But I could never find a deck for it. And now it has a home. And that is Mirrodin Besieged. This card is beautiful. When it enters the battlefield, you choose either Mirrodin or Phyrexian. We're going to ignore that Mirrodin part. Doesn't matter. I'm never going to choose that. Not once. All that matters is Phyrexia. When it enters, there is only one choice. You will be completed. You will become one with Phyrexia. Long live Phyrexia. Choose Phyrexia. All right, but what does it actually do? That might be helpful. Again, forget the Mirrodin part, but that Phyrexian part. On your end step, every turn, you get to go ahead and loot, so you draw a card and discard a card, which is already a cool effect to have, but it gets better, obviously. And that is, after that, if you have 15 or more artifacts in your graveyard, target player loses the game. This is insanely awesome. In a deck where we are milling ourselves a lot, and our graveyard can fill up fast, 15 artifacts is not hard to get. We're in the low 30s, I believe, artifact-wise, and milling half of your deck happens quite often in this deck. You play this out, that is ridiculous. The looting by itself is awesome because there are certain cards we don't want in our hand, we want in our graveyard as Scarab God targets. By itself is great. But yeah, I have not pulled this off yet. But when it does happen, oh my gosh, it will be beautiful. This while Infect and killing players with Infect is an amazing way to win the game, this might be the next best thing. This is the second most Phyrexian way to win the game, and that's good enough for me. But besides all of this beautiful Phyrexian goodness on this card, it is also like one of the pettiest win cons of all time, in that like somebody just does something you don't like, some player's been targeting you, they've been trying to kill you all game. You drop this, you have the artifacts in your graveyard, you just look somebody in the eye and say, you lose the game. And that is, one day I'll be able to say this to Ken. He has killed this deck so many times. One day I will play this card, be able to look Ken in the eyes and say you lose the game. Hasn't happened yet, but when it does, it will be beautiful. That's gonna do it for this week's deck tech or deck update. Really hope y'all enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what you think about this whole concept of updating these decks. If y'all kind of don't want to see it anymore, you want to see new commanders, let me know. But if you are interested, there are quite a few decks I have changed quite a bit since initially deck teching them. So I would love to give updates, updated deck lists, updated win cons, all that type of stuff. For me, it's a ton of fun going back over them. But yeah, definitely let me know what y'all think down in the comments. And as always, a huge shout out to the patrons. We love and appreciate y'all so much. Thank you so much for believing in what we do. And as always, make sure on Saturday nights, 8:30, check out Commander Petty. It is always petty. It is always fun. And we always appreciate all the trash talk in the comments. Mostly it's not trash talk. It's just catching all our misplays and making sure we don't cheat, which is much appreciated. But also feel free to talk trash. But yes, tons and tons of stuff to come. Hopefully more deck updates depending on what y'all think. But until then, I will see y'all next time.